Hello, my name is Stan, and this video is to follow up on our ad, our Facebook ad, that was specifically sent to meditators, and with the extraordinary capacities of Facebook now, we were able to focus on meditative people with some kind of meditative practice or similarly related interests. So we want to follow up with that ad. We make some claims in the ad that I want to explain a little more, and probably limit this video just to that. If you, for further introduction to it, you might want to go to our website. In fact, definitely, if you get interested in floating vertically, go to verticalfloat.com. We have some other videos that more physically show you what it's about. But here we're just trying to focus on the psycho-emotional aspects, the quote-unquote spiritual aspect of floating. What to expect, how to roll with it, how to deal with it, why this claim of ours that a shift of consciousness is virtually guaranteed, assuming you're not in there assuming you're not actively trying to resist it. I imagine that could be if if somebody wanted to do that. But for the ordinary person who gets in a tank and wants to relax and wants to experience what it has to offer, there's simply no choice. Your consciousness will shift. So I want to explain what that means, because it means different things to different people. And the best way to do that is to right away point out that what I mean by it, and other authors and so forth mean, not everybody does, but to my mind, consciousness is just part of intelligence. It's an important part. It's the past-based part of intelligence. So consciousness is what we build up over time from infancy onward, right? This suggests that there's something else besides consciousness, which I would say there obviously is, and it's very different functionally from consciousness, and that is awareness. Awareness is presence-based, all right? So now, what we've done here, what I'm presenting to you, is something that can be very easily contrasted in a binary opposition. And I'm going to say this is very important, because a binary opposition does not require thinking. Binary opposition is pre-logical. It's how awareness, it's how any kind of sensation is even possible. If you think about it, any kind of sensitivity before there even is thinking, it's how an infant eventually becomes able to think, is that sensitivity is this genius for detecting differences. And what's a difference? A difference is a relationship between opposites, or between very different things. Without that difference, those things, this is a profound principle that we're not going to go into too much here, but this is profound. If there's no difference between things, as far as consciousness, as far as awareness is concerned, or as far as intelligence is concerned, those things are invisible. Those things don't even really, they can't exist. If you can't detect the difference between things, those things are basically not separate. That's why camouflage works, etc., etc. Okay, so sensation is a means of differentiation: hot from cold, dark from light. It's very simple. That's where we start. Consciousness is much more complex. Consciousness takes that data and those contrasts eventually are built up, just like the contrast of 0, 1 in a computer is, when you've got enough of those and you merge and mix and match them in different ways, you get information. A contrast isn't really even information yet. It's simple data. All right. So we've got these two sides of ourselves. We have, at all times, we have a sensory presence that's contrastive in its fundamental nature. And then we have a perceptual side of ourselves. And there's many ways of putting this. There's many ways of phrasing this contrast. And the more of them that you look at, the better. The more of them and we can't do that all. We can't do much of that in this video. That's going to be a later kind of further expansion of this view. Because the more you do it, the more the more clarity you have around what our actual true framework of reality is embedded in us naturally. This is not a philosophy. This is not a belief system. It's either, do you want to see this or not? You see, we're operating, then the problem is we're operating from a constructed framework of reality, a socially constructed framework of reality. That's valuable, but we've made way too much of it. It's actually, what we're using as a framework of reality is more like a framework of technology. It's more like a framework of economy. The ego is really an economic instrument that we become over-identified with. The ego is not our identity. You need an ego. You got to have an ego to get around in the world and to make some necessary value judgments. See, that's another way of phrasing the problem, is that we're trapped in a very complex, reactive, interreactive worldview that's been socially put together, and we've become so complex we can't see back to this our own very simple nature. That's the whole challenge here. So here's another contrast, the complex and the simple. All right. So when you get in the tank, what's going on? You see, for now, let's just stick with one simple contrast. You and I, as we are conversing, it's me talking and you listening. If it were the reverse, it would be the same. But I'm sending out sounds which you're instantly interpreting. Right? If you didn't know English, they'd just be sounds, right? So you would have an awareness of sound, but you wouldn't be perceiving the meanings as you are. Look at what's happening. Instantaneously, there's no delay here. Just instantaneously, you are reactively getting the meanings of those words, and you're putting them together, and we're communicating. It's a miracle. It's fantastic, right? So, the extremely important point. These two opposites, sensation, reception, and then your interpretation is a reaction. They're hand in glove. They're absolutely seamlessly cooperating here, and yet they're opposites. They're functionally, the way to put this is functionally they're opposites. Now some people say, well, that's not important. You're being dualistic. What's the point of that? It's all one. Okay, well, yeah, it is at some level. But I'm saying there's a lot, it's extremely important to understand, to get this distinction. You can always go back to the oneness. We're not saying that they're not one at another level, right? But we're saying, see, if you understand this distinction, you begin to see where our big mistake is. You begin to understand that there's a dynamic interplay where one can be predominant, and when one's predominant, the other is necessarily shrunken back. In other words, one. So, and there's times when that's natural. There's times when that's needed. There's times when you don't want a lot of extraneous sensation going on. You need to focus totally, especially if you're driving or something, or let's say something even more intensely, possibly dangerous. You don't want distractions. At other times, you want to kind of shut down the thinking apparatus. You want to just allow your way, like if you're listening to music or you're making love or whatever. So we do this. We're actually shifting around naturally all the time anyway. When you become aware of this, okay. However, in general, human beings are stuck for they're stuck in a framework of reality that keeps them in an overreactive mode, you know, way too much of the time. We're out of balance as a species in general. All right. When you get in the tank, here's why I'm bringing all this up. When you get in the tank, it's very simple to see this, especially if you have this intellectual bridge in mind, and verify it for yourself. Don't take it from me. I think you're gonna put it in your own words, however you want to phrase it. When you get in the tank, suddenly your perception, it's pitch black. You're out of gravity. You're no longer reactively holding yourself. You know, all that's gone. The brain is relieved from all of that doing of keeping you in space and keeping your muscles, you know, tensed and all that. Suddenly you're like this. It's like you're in outer space, right? And there's nothing to perceive. So what happens is that whole reactive side of yourself gets a nice break, and when it does, your sensory side opens up. There's no way around that. That's and it can be very powerful. And it's especially powerful when you're in a vertical position. Just as meditators or qigong artists or whatever, you know how important it is to be upright in a state of relaxed alertness. Right? When that happens, insights are possible, fresh insights, fresh contrasts. See, by an insight, we're not talking about an analytical thought-based thing here. We're talking about suddenly seeing right to the bottom of some structure, so that the structure often of a whole lot of complexity just goes. That's the only way that it can go. That's the only way that it can dissolve back into, it was constructed in the first place. You're not going to resolve it with more thinking about it. Usually. I mean, there's a place for thinking. I'm not this is not either or thinking here, okay? This is both and thinking. This is balance. We're talking about balance. Bringing the two into balance. We're not talking about demonizing perceptions now, right? Unlike the socially constructed framework, the old one that's still with us, unfortunately, in many ways, that tends to demonize or tends to devalue sensitivity, period, sensuality, all of that, right? And greatly magnify the importance of thought. Thought is next to godliness and all that stuff. Now, we can understand how that got going. As human beings began thinking and sharing and gathering knowledge and all this technology came, you know, it's important to have a compassionate critique of how we got to be so screwed up as a species. You know, you need to understand all that. You need to understand the framework, and the easiest and most simplest way, without a whole lot of philosophical jargon and so forth, which is absolutely unnecessary, is to come back to the level of simple contrasts. And in future videos, future blogs and so forth, I'm going to go into this, because contrasting takes us right to the root of everything. And I'm going to say that this contrast that we're talking about here can be put in about 50 or 100 different ways, at least 50 that are pretty potent, although you'll end up using maybe 15 or 20, or maybe only 10, or maybe only one or two. Start with one or two. See the difference between perception and sensation. When you're driving the car, allow yourself to realize that. Try to dwell in the contrast, is the way I put that. So I'm observing how I'm reactively, you know, the steering wheel, I'm reacting, but those reactions are secondary to the reception of what's going on. The reception is the unpredictable. The reaction is predictably in control of the car. So here's another way. Here's another way of putting that contrast. We've got the unpredictable always in life, not just driving, right? You don't know what I'm going to say next. The only way you're going to is by listening, is by sensing that you have to let the sound of my voice come in before you can interpret it properly. Obvious, you know, come on. Simple, extremely simple. So simple that we miss it all the time, that we miss the importance of it. We're devaluing sensitivity. And we devalue it because of our framework of reality. Our framework of reality is in fact value-ridden. You see, sensing is invaluable. It doesn't fit in that. So here's another. We've got the world of non-value, and we've got the world of valuing. And a value, when you value something, you've got a whole different category of contrasts, a whole different class of contrasts. It's not this complementary both and thinking anymore. It's a hierarchical either or, where something is superior to something else. That's what valuation is. You need a value system, and every creature has a value system, but it's secondary. It's a past-based, it's the reactive side of intelligence, and it's absolutely dependent for it to properly unfold. It's absolutely dependent on accurately receiving what's really going on. Only then can you evaluate it correctly. If you're caught up in an evaluative world before if you're way so caught up in it, it's possible to be so caught up in valuational thinking that you're literally unable to sense what's actually going on. You're projecting all kinds of values onto that before you've adequately received it. And I'm sure you know what I'm saying as a meditator. Fundamentally, this is extremely simple. It's so simple that we miss it all the time because we value complexity. In fact, what do we call the complex typically? Here's a quiz. I'm sure you know the answer. What we call the complex is the higher, the good, the superior. And we imagine ourselves as thinking beings, I mean, maybe you don't, right? But as a culture, this is, I really avoid the whole higher lower contrast now. I'm watching it all the time because I still can fall into it, right? I say, wait a minute, why am I projecting higher lower? No, it's complex. It's complex, simple. Here is the real contrast. And right away that deflates whatever. You're going to find that any kind of emotional upset, any sort of, like, let's say you get in the tank and you've got this disturbance because suddenly you're shifted. You've got this incredible awareness. All of a sudden, I mean, can happen very rapidly. Suddenly, you've got this marvelous awareness of the whole structure of your reactive being. That can be very powerful. It can be very valuable if you can stay with it. So we recommend stay with that as much as you can. If it's too much, if it's just really disturbing, then get out for a second. Even a minute will shrink it, and it'll change it. You'll be able to tolerate it. Get back in. If it comes, get out as many times as you need to. But for the most part, try to stay with it. Try to allow the observance of this contrast between here you are observing this structure that's obviously past-based, profoundly past-based. It's an entanglement. It's a whole structure of. It's like the bottom part of the iceberg that's always in the background of consciousness, limiting us emotionally. Right. Well, what I started to say is any kind of emotional issue like that is riddled with hierarchical thinking. It's riddled with valuational presumptions. Gain and loss, right and wrong, good and bad, pride and shame. See, that's how we're manipulated. We're profoundly manipulated. How when you identify with an ego and you have to defend your ego, you're caught up in this pride shame thing. It's powerful. It's very powerful. And the most effective means to cut through all that entanglement. I love that word entanglement because it's literally this reaction upon reaction upon reaction from day one, infancy of being, identifying ourselves as this egoic entity. Suddenly say, wait a minute, that's all past based. That's all over. That's all here. What am I fundamentally? What am I primarily? Past based? No. I didn't have all that as an infant. What did I have as an infant? I had this I had this marvelous sensitivity. I had this incredible, mysterious, open awareness. And it's always here. It didn't go anywhere. It's just buried by reactive preoccupations. Okay. This thing has been long enough. I think I've given you a sense of why the tank can be so powerful. You're suddenly thrown into awareness, whether you're ready or not. And you guys are the most ready people on the planet, right? Anybody who's serious about meditating is going to embrace this. Is going to profit from it. It's going to incorporate it rapidly into their practice. And this intellectual framework that we're talking about here is extremely important to bring into it, I believe. I think it's you see, we're adding to the mystical canon here. It's not just mysticism anymore, as valuable as that whole thing is. And I mean, I believe that's the most valuable literature on earth, collectively. The Sufi, the Zen, the Taoist, the Buddhist, those core teachings, then they all boil down to extremely simple contrastive difference between presence and pastness. All right, but we've got more than that now. We've got biology. We've got social science. That's what when I mentioned that our perspective in the ad, I claimed that our perspective here, this whole business of a framework of reality, that's coming from social science. That's coming from other disciplines besides mysticism. It's bringing that into this discussion just solidifies it, just clarifies it all the more, and the biological aspect of it, right? So we've got an advantage, and plus, a lot of those mystics back in the day, they were limited by their own culture. They were limited by their own. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the ability to survey what all the other mystics are saying, right, as we can now, and we can begin to see how it all boils down to 3 words. Basically, be more present. Or, actually, let me rephrase that. Be more in your native presence. There's a real difference between presence and the present. I'm going to leave it at that. That's your koan. Okay. Hope there'll be a lot more videos, blog, so forth. This has been going on quite a long time. I'm going to cut it off now here. So, hope it helps. We'll see you sometime. Take care.